A retired Army combat medic walked into the VA, believing he would finally receive the benefits he had earned in war. Instead, he was told there was no proof his sacrifice had ever happened. But as Daniel Harper quietly folded the denial letter and walked away without a word, no one in that room realized they had just dismissed a man whose greatest act of courage had been buried for nearly 20 years. By the time the truth finally came to light, an entire community would discover that some of America's greatest heroes don't ask to be remembered. They simply never stop serving. Rain had a way of making every small town look older. The brick buildings along Main Street in Ashford, North Carolina, stood beneath a gray sky that seemed unwilling to welcome the morning. Water rolled down the windows of the Veterans Affairs Regional Office in thin streams, blurring the American flag outside until its colors melted into the storm.
Daniel Harper stopped for a moment before climbing the front steps. He wore the same brown canvas jacket he had owned for nearly 15 years. The sleeves were faded at the cuffs, and one pocket had been stitched twice by hand. His boots had seen better days, but they were polished anyway. Old habits survived long after uniforms disappeared. He glanced toward the flag as it snapped quietly in the wind. Then he stepped inside. The waiting room smelled of coffee, printer toner, and wet coats. Veterans of every age sat beneath fluorescent lights, some staring silently at television screens mounted high on the wall, others holding folders swollen with decades of paperwork. Every face carried its own story. Some wore baseball caps embroidered with names of wars, others hid their eyes beneath them. Daniel checked in without complaint. "Mr. Harper?" the receptionist asked politely. "Yes, ma'am." "They're ready for you." He nodded once.
The clerk who greeted him inside the benefits office looked no older than 30. She seemed kind enough, but there was hesitation in her eyes before she slid a single envelope across the desk.
"I'm sorry,"
she said softly.
"This is the final determination."
Daniel thanked her before opening it. He read every line. His expression never changed. The letter explained that the department had found insufficient documentation linking his current disabilities to his military service. Several medical records from his final deployment could not be verified. Without those records, his claim could not be approved. Years of waiting. Medical examinations, appeals, letters, phone calls. Everything had ended in 3 carefully typed paragraphs.
"I'm very sorry," the clerk repeated.
Daniel folded the letter with the same precision he might once have folded a field dressing. "It's not your fault," he replied. His voice remained calm. He stood, shook her hand, and wished her a good day. Around the room, several people had been watching. A man in a wheelchair lowered his eyes. An elderly woman squeezed her husband's hand. Near the corner, a young reporter closed the notebook resting on her lap. Emily Carter had come to the VA building hoping to interview local veterans about healthcare access. Instead, she had witnessed something she couldn't explain. Most people argued, some shouted, others cried. This man had done none of those things. He had accepted humiliation with the quiet discipline of someone who had spent a lifetime carrying heavier burdens. As Daniel reached the exit, the security guard opened the door for him. "Take care, sir." Daniel smiled. "You too." Outside, the rain had grown heavier. He tucked the envelope inside his jacket and walked toward an aging blue pickup truck parked near the far edge of the lot. The truck coughed twice before the engine finally started. The heater barely worked. The windshield wipers squeaked across the glass. Still, Daniel drove away without looking back. Emily watched him leave. Something about him stayed with her. She couldn't explain why. By early afternoon, the storm had spread across the county. Traffic slowed along Highway 64 as rain pounded the pavement. Daniel drove carefully, keeping both hands steady on the wheel, despite the ache that always settled deep inside his right shoulder whenever the weather turned cold. The injury had never completely healed. Some mornings, he could barely lift a coffee mug. He had learned long ago not to complain. About 10 miles outside town, flashing hazard lights appeared through the curtain of rain. An old pickup sat crooked on the shoulder, Its hood was raised. An elderly man stood beside it, soaked to the skin, while struggling to wave down passing traffic. Most cars continued past. Daniel eased onto the shoulder without hesitation. He climbed out, pulling the collar of his jacket higher against the rain. "You all right?" he asked. The older man looked embarrassed.
I think she's finally given up on me.
Daniel smiled gently. "Let's have a look." The battery cable had worked loose after years of rust. Daniel borrowed a wrench from the truck's toolbox, tightened the connection, and checked the engine. A few minutes later, the pickup started. The old man laughed with relief. "I owe you." Daniel shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. At least let me pay you." "No, sir." The old man noticed Daniel rubbing his shoulder as he packed away the tools. "You hurt?" "Just getting older." "You sure?" Daniel smiled again. "I've had worse days." The stranger reached into his wallet anyway. Daniel refused before the money ever left it. Instead, he walked back to his truck. The old man called after him. "I never even got your name." Daniel paused. "Daniel Harper." "Well, Mr. Harper, thank you." Daniel nodded once and drove away. Neither man noticed the woman parked across the highway. Emily had followed him almost by accident. Curiosity had led her onto the same road after leaving the VA office.
She watched the entire exchange through rain-speckled glass.
A man who had just been denied the benefits he had earned had stopped to help someone else before helping himself. That wasn't the kind of story she usually covered. It was the kind people rarely noticed. Back in town, Daniel parked beside a modest white house at the edge of an aging neighborhood. The porch needed paint. The mailbox leaned slightly. A folded American flag rested inside a glass case on the living room shelf beside a faded photograph of soldiers standing beneath a desert sunrise. Daniel glanced at it only briefly. Then he removed the denial letter from his jacket. He placed it inside an old metal box already filled with medical forms, appeal documents, and military correspondence dating back nearly 20 years. He closed the lid, locked it, and quietly began preparing dinner, as though nothing unusual had happened. Across town, Emily sat inside the newsroom.
Rain tapped softly against the windows while she searched military databases available to journalists.
Daniel Harper, United States Army, combat medic, Iraq. Several entries appeared. Then, nothing. Deployment records stopped abruptly. Medical documentation referenced by later files simply didn't exist. Entire sections had been marked unavailable. She frowned. Veterans' records were sometimes incomplete, but this was different. Too many pages were missing. Too many dates ended without explanation. Even stranger, a notation buried deep inside an archived personnel index referred to supporting documents that no longer appeared anywhere in the file. Emily leaned closer to the screen. Someone had removed more than paperwork. Someone had erased part of a man's history. Outside, thunder rolled across the Carolina sky. Inside the quiet newsroom, Emily opened a fresh notebook and wrote one sentence across the top of the first page. Who is Daniel Harper? And why does it look like someone wanted the truth to disappear? The question stayed with her long after the office lights began to dim. Most stories came with obvious villains, dramatic confrontations, or headlines that practically wrote themselves. This one offered only silence. A veteran who never complained, missing records, a denied claim, and a man who had chosen to help a stranded stranger less than an hour after losing something he had waited years to receive. Silence could hide many things. Sometimes it hid dignity. Sometimes it hid pain. And sometimes, Emily had learned, it hid the truth. The following morning, sunlight finally broke through the storm clouds, washing the small town in soft gold. Store owners swept rainwater from their sidewalks while church bells echoed across Main Street. It looked like an ordinary American morning. Daniel Harper was already awake long before sunrise. He had never completely lost the habits the Army had built into him. His coffee brewed before 5.
His bed was made with perfect corners. Every tool in his garage hung exactly where it belonged. His shoulder protested as he buttoned his flannel shirt. The old injuries stiffened every morning before gradually surrendering to movement. He rolled it once, slowly, then reached for a faded baseball cap embroidered with the words, U.S. Army Veteran. He climbed into his aging pickup and drove toward the Ashford Veterans Outreach Center. The building wasn't large. It had once been an elementary school before volunteers transformed it into a shelter and community center for veterans struggling to rebuild their lives. Daniel never arrived empty-handed. This morning he carried 2 boxes filled with donated blankets and canned food collected from neighbors who knew he would always find someone in greater need. Inside, the familiar smell of fresh coffee greeted him. "Mornin', Daniel," called Martha Jenkins, the volunteer coordinator. She smiled warmly as she saw him carrying the heavy boxes. "You know you're supposed to let younger folks do that."
Daniel chuckled. "I've been hearing that for 20 years. And have you listened once?" "Not yet," she laughed. "Some people entered the shelter looking for help. Daniel came looking for ways to give it. By 8 o'clock, he was kneeling beside an old wheelchair whose right brake refused to lock properly. A former Marine named Frank sat patiently nearby. "Think she's got another year left?" Frank asked. Daniel examined the worn mechanism. "If we take care of her, she'll outlive both of us." Within minutes, the brake clicked into place. Daniel tested it twice before handing it back. "There you go." Frank rolled forward, then back. "Perfect. Keep the wheels clean." "I will." Frank reached into his pocket. "At least let me buy you lunch." Daniel shook his head. "You already paid." "When?" "You served." Frank looked down. "So did you." Daniel simply smiled. Conversation ended there. Neither man believed service was something that deserved applause.
Outside, a young homeless veteran stood hesitating near the entrance. His clothes were dirty. His beard had grown uneven. His hands trembled. Daniel noticed him immediately. He walked outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You hungry?" The young man nodded without meeting his eyes. Daniel handed him both a sandwich and the hotter cup. "No questions," he said gently. "Just eat." The younger veteran finally looked up. "You don't even know my name," Daniel answered quietly. "You don't need one for kindness." The words lingered long after breakfast was finished. Across town, Emily Carter had begun making phone calls. Military archives, VA representatives, county records. Most conversations ended politely. Others ended abruptly. No one seemed able to explain why several years of Daniel Harper's deployment records had disappeared. Finally, one clerk quietly suggested she speak with Dr. Harold Simmons. He retired from the VA hospital last year. He handled a lot of combat injury cases. He might remember something. Emily drove 30 minutes to a modest brick house overlooking a small lake. Dr. Simmons answered the door with a cane in one hand and reading glasses perched low on his nose. When she mentioned Daniel Harper's name, the old physician grew unusually quiet. "I remember him." "You do?" "I remember every veteran who tried harder to heal everyone else than himself." They sat on the porch overlooking the water. Birds skimmed across the surface, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine. "He never complained," Dr. Simmons said. "Not once." Emily opened her notebook. "What happened to him overseas?" The doctor looked toward the lake for a long moment. "I don't know everything, but I know enough to tell you this. Daniel's injuries matched what I'd expect from someone who had been dangerously close to an explosion." "So why doesn't the VA have those records?" Dr. Simmons sighed. "Because when I requested copies years ago, they weren't there." "You mean they were lost?" "No." His expression hardened. "I mean, they were already missing." Emily stopped writing. "What does that mean?" "It means someone removed something." The old physician leaned forward.
I've worked with veterans for 40 years. I've seen paperwork delayed. I've seen files damaged. I've never seen pages disappear so cleanly. A chill settled over Emily despite the warm afternoon. Back in Ashford, Daniel finished repairing the last wheelchair before loading groceries into his truck. Every Wednesday, he delivered food to elderly residents who could no longer drive. His first stop was Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker. She lived alone in a weathered farmhouse surrounded by maple trees. Daniel carried her groceries inside without being asked. "You spoil me," she teased. "I just save you the drive." She smiled knowingly. "You always say that." As he placed soup cans neatly into her pantry, she noticed him rubbing his shoulder again. "It hurting today?" "A little." "You should see a doctor." "I've seen plenty." She wanted to say more. Instead, she handed him a small paper bag.
I baked peach pie.
"You'll take half." Daniel laughed softly. "I never win these arguments." "No." "You never do." He accepted the pie because refusing would have hurt her feelings more than accepting her generosity. That was another lesson the army had never taught him. Life had. Late that afternoon, Emily visited the military cemetery on the edge of town. She had been told Daniel often came there. Rows of white headstones stretched across the green hillside beneath enormous oak trees. American flags fluttered gently beside many graves. She found him kneeling before one simple marker. No cameras, no audience, no ceremony. He was replacing faded flowers with fresh ones. After brushing a few fallen leaves from the stone, he stood quietly for several seconds, not speaking, just remembering. Emily waited until he turned. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Daniel offered a polite nod. "You aren't." "I'm Emily Carter. I saw you yesterday." "I know." "You followed me." She looked slightly embarrassed. "I did. I wanted to ask a few questions." Daniel looked back toward the headstone. "Not here." She respected the answer. Instead of pressing him, she asked something else. "Did you know him well?" Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the name carved into the marble. "He was 23. He liked old country music. He laughed too loud. He wanted to become a science teacher." Emily glanced down. The headstone simply read, "Specialist Michael Lawson, 1980 to 2004. "So you served together?" Daniel nodded once. "We came home differently." It was the first thing he had said about the war. Emily sensed the weight behind those words. She chose not to ask another question. Some stories opened only when they were ready. As Daniel walked back toward his truck, Emily noticed him pause briefly. His breathing changed. His shoulders stiffened. Far away, somewhere beyond the cemetery, construction workers had begun using heavy equipment. A sudden metallic boom echoed across the valley. Daniel froze. For one heartbeat. Two. His eyes searched empty air as though expecting something only he could see. Then the sound faded. He exhaled slowly, straightened his cap, and kept walking. Emily said nothing. She simply wrote one word in her notebook. PTSD. That evening, after returning to the newsroom, she opened Daniel Harper's digital military file again. She compared dates, medical reports, transfer orders, personnel records. One deployment summary referenced attached treatment documentation. The attachment no longer existed. Another report listed a commanding officer whose own service history had also been partially sealed. Too many missing pieces. Too many coincidences. Her office phone rang. She answered absent-mindedly. "Emily Carter." The voice on the other end was old, measured, military. "I understand you're asking questions about Daniel Harper." Emily sat upright. "Who is this?" "My name isn't important." "It will be." A brief silence followed. Finally, the man spoke again. "I retired as a colonel 12 years ago.
I served with people who served beside Daniel. Emily's pulse quickened. Can we meet? You can. But listen carefully. His voice lowered. If you're investigating Daniel Harper, you're asking questions that some people buried 20 years ago. The line went dead. Emily stared at the silent phone. Outside, darkness settled over Ashford. Somewhere across town, Daniel Harper sat alone on his front porch, holding a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. He watched the American flag hanging beside his porch sway gently in the evening breeze. For years he had believed the past was finally behind him. He had no idea that someone had just begun digging it back into the light. The next morning arrived with a pale blue sky and the crisp air that often settled over North Carolina after a hard rain. Daniel Harper followed the same routine he had followed for years. He watered the flowers beside his porch, fed the stray orange cat that visited every sunrise, and left for town before most people had finished breakfast. Routine had become his shelter. As long as every day looked like the one before it, memories stayed where they belonged. Or so he believed. Across town, Emily Carter parked outside a quiet brick church where the retired colonel had agreed to meet her. The man had insisted on neutral ground. Not his home, not her office. Somewhere simple. Colonel Thomas Whitaker looked every bit the soldier he once had been. His silver hair was neatly trimmed. His back remained remarkably straight despite his 72 years. He carried no briefcase, only a weathered leather folder tucked beneath one arm. He shook Emily's hand firmly. You came alone. I did. Good. They sat on a wooden bench beneath a sprawling oak tree as church bells echoed softly across the square. Emily opened her notebook.
I've been trying to understand why Daniel Harper's records are incomplete.
Whitaker remained silent for several moments. When people hear the word hero, he finally said, they imagine someone standing in front of cameras with medals pinned across their chest. He looked toward the church steeple. Real heroes usually spend the rest of their lives trying to disappear. Emily waited. I can't tell you everything, he continued. Some parts remain protected even today. But I can tell you this. Daniel Harper didn't lose those records. They were sealed because of what happened during one mission. Emily leaned forward. Iraq? Whitaker nodded. Spring of 2005, the Western Desert. A supply convoy that should never have become a battlefield. His voice drifted away, and for the first time Emily saw not an officer, but an old man carrying memories heavier than age itself. It was supposed to be routine. Medicine, water, fuel. Nothing extraordinary. But intelligence failed. The convoy drove directly into an ambush. Emily stopped writing. The colonel noticed. Everything after that happened in minutes. Minutes that changed dozens of lives. He closed the folder without opening it. I wasn't there, but I've read every report that survived. And I've spoken with every soldier who came home. Every one of them says the same thing. If Daniel hadn't ignored orders, most of them would never have seen America again. Emily felt the weight of the statement settle between them. What orders? Whitaker looked directly into her eyes. To stay back. Daniel spent the morning repairing shelves inside the veteran shelter. A younger volunteer named Chris struggled to lift a heavy cabinet. I've got it, Daniel said. No, sir, Chris answered quickly. Doctor said you shouldn't lift anything over 20 pounds. Daniel smiled. My doctor says a lot of things. Together they carried the cabinet into place. Chris wiped sweat from his forehead. I heard about your VA appeal. Daniel's hands stopped for only a second. News travels fast.
People are angry.
Daniel simply shrugged. Being angry won't fix paperwork. It isn't fair. No. But fairness isn't something life promises. Chris looked at him carefully. You don't seem bitter. Daniel tightened the final screw. "I've buried men who never got another sunrise." He stood. "That changes your definition of a bad day." Emily's investigation took her farther than she expected. She drove to Raleigh, then Fayetteville, then a quiet neighborhood outside Jacksonville, where another veteran agreed to speak only after she promised not to record his face. His name was Marcus Doyle, a former Army sergeant. His left leg ended below the knee. He answered the door with the aid of a carbon fiber prosthetic. "You want to know about Daniel?" Emily nodded. Marcus laughed softly. "Funny. He'd hate that. He never wanted anyone talking about him." Inside, framed family photographs covered the fireplace. Children, graduations, fishing trips, ordinary moments. Marcus noticed Emily studying them. "I wasn't supposed to have any of this."
What do you mean?
"I was trapped. Vehicle rolled. Fire everywhere. I remember smoke. I remember screaming. I remember somebody dragging me." His eyes drifted toward the window. "I didn't know it was Daniel until months later." Emily frowned. "You never saw him?" "No, I was unconscious most of the time." "So how did you find out?" Marcus reached into a drawer. From inside, he removed a faded photograph. 6 soldiers stood together beneath the blazing Iraqi sun. Daniel looked much younger. Dust covered his uniform. His smile was almost shy. Marcus pointed toward him. "That's the man who carried me." Emily studied the image. "What happened afterward?" Marcus became quiet. "They told us he kept going back. Again and again." There were still men inside another vehicle. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. "How many trips?" "No one agrees. 3, maybe 4. People stopped counting." She lowered the photograph. "Did he receive a medal?" Marcus gave a sad smile. "He received scars."
Late that afternoon, Daniel finished delivering supplies to a community food pantry. As he loaded empty boxes into his truck, he noticed a teenage boy sitting alone behind the building. The boy couldn't have been older than 16. His backpack was torn. His clothes were damp. He stared at the pavement with hollow eyes. Daniel walked over slowly. "You waiting for someone?" The teenager shook his head. "No." "You hungry?" A shrug. Daniel disappeared into the pantry and returned carrying 2 sandwiches. They sat together on the curb. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, the boy whispered, "I ran away." Daniel nodded as though he'd expected the answer. "You got family?" "My mom." "We fight." "You planning on sleeping out here tonight?" The boy didn't answer. Daniel looked toward the setting sun. "When I was young," he said quietly, "I thought running away solved problems." "It doesn't. It only changes where the problems are." The teenager glanced sideways. "You sound like you've seen a lot." Daniel smiled faintly. "I've seen enough." Instead of calling the police immediately, Daniel first asked the boy if he would allow someone to help him. An hour later, after patient conversation and a shared meal, the frightened teenager agreed to meet with a local youth counselor. Daniel stayed until he saw the counselor arrive. Only then did he quietly leave. No one applauded. No cameras appeared. Another good deed disappeared into the ordinary rhythm of the day. Exactly the way Daniel preferred. Emily spent that evening inside the county archives comparing names from old deployment rosters. One document led to another. A transfer order, a casualty summary, an operations log. Then something unusual caught her eye. A recommendation form. Most of it remained blacked out. Only a few lines were readable. Recommended for the nation's highest Valor Award. Recipient, Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper. Stat, never processed. Emily stared at the screen. That couldn't be right.
Awards of that magnitude didn't simply vanish, unless something else had happened.
She immediately called Colonel Whitaker.
I found a recommendation. There was a long silence.
What does it say?
Never processed. The colonel sighed.
So it still exists.
You knew?
I knew it had been written.
I never knew whether it survived.
Emily's voice lowered.
Why wasn't it approved?
I don't know.
Or maybe...
He stopped himself. Emily waited.
Maybe someone decided another story needed to be protected. What story?
I can't answer that.
You will.
I hope one day I can. Before hanging up, Whitaker spoke one final sentence. The bravest thing Daniel Harper ever did wasn't running into danger. Emily frowned.
What was it?
He accepted blame that never belonged to him. The call ended. Emily remained alone beneath the dim archive lights, staring at the partially redacted recommendation. Outside, night settled across North Carolina. Far away, Daniel Harper sat on his porch, listening to crickets sing beneath the stars. He believed the hardest battles of his life had ended somewhere in the Iraqi desert.
He still didn't know that the war was slowly finding its way home. Not through bullets or explosions, but through forgotten documents, old witnesses, and a truth that had waited nearly 20 years for someone brave enough to uncover it. The first article appeared on a quiet Sunday morning. It wasn't sensational. There were no dramatic headlines or accusations. Emily Carter simply wrote what she could prove. A decorated Army combat medic had been denied the disability benefits he had pursued for years. Significant portions of his military records appeared to be missing. Former soldiers were now questioning whether those missing documents had changed the course of one veteran's entire life. By noon, the story had spread far beyond Ashford. Veterans organizations shared it. Military families reposted it. Retired service members began recognizing a familiar name. Some remembered Daniel Harper. Others remembered only fragments of an operation everyone had been discouraged from discussing. The questions multiplied faster than anyone expected. How could combat injuries simply disappear from an official record? Why had a recommendation for a Valor Award never been processed? Who had decided that a soldier's sacrifice no longer deserved recognition? Emily's phone began ringing almost without pause. Some callers offered sympathy, others offered names. One voicemail simply said, "I was there. I think it's time." Daniel, meanwhile, started his Monday exactly as he always did. Before sunrise, he unlocked the side entrance of the VA hospital volunteer wing. He knew nearly every nurse by name. He knew which veterans preferred silence and which wanted someone to sit beside them for a while. Room 214 belonged to Harold Benson, a Vietnam veteran recovering from heart surgery. Daniel carried in 2 cups of coffee. Harold smiled weakly. "You heard you're famous now?" Daniel looked puzzled. "I don't think so. The television says otherwise." Harold pointed toward the small television mounted high on the wall. Emily's story filled the screen. Daniel watched only long enough to recognize his own photograph. It had been taken years earlier during a Memorial Day service. He quietly reached for the remote and lowered the volume. "I'm not sure I like this." Harold chuckled. "None of us ever do." Daniel handed in the coffee. "You feeling stronger today?" "A little. My grandson's visiting tomorrow. That's worth getting stronger for." They spent the next 20 minutes talking about fishing, grandchildren, and old pickup trucks. Not once did Daniel mention the news. As he stepped back into the hallway, 2 younger veterans waiting for physical therapy stood and shook his hand. One of them looked embarrassed. "I read about what happened." Daniel nodded politely. "I'm sorry." Daniel smiled. "You didn't do anything." "No, but somebody did." Daniel looked down the hallway lined with American flags and family photographs. "Then I hope they fix it." His answer carried no anger, only quiet hope. Emily's investigation grew larger than she had imagined. Military historians contacted her. Retired officers requested meetings. Even a congressional staff member asked for copies of her findings. But the most unexpected visitor arrived late Tuesday afternoon. A middle-aged woman entered the newsroom carrying an old wooden box wrapped in a faded army blanket. "My name is Sarah Lawson," she said softly. Emily immediately recognized the surname. "Michael Lawson?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "My brother." The same young soldier whose grave Daniel visited every month. She carefully opened the box. Inside rested dozens of letters, photographs, military patches, a cracked wristwatch. At the very bottom lay a sealed envelope. "It was mailed to our parents after Michael died." Emily carefully unfolded the yellowed paper. The handwriting was unmistakably personal, not military, not official. It was Daniel's. Sarah spoke quietly. "My mother read this letter every Memorial Day until she passed away." Emily read the first few lines. "Mr. and Mrs. Lawson, there aren't words that can replace your son. I wish there were. Michael gave everything he had trying to protect the men beside him. If anyone deserves to be remembered, it's him, not me." Emily swallowed hard. The letter continued. "He died making sure others could live. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to honor that gift. Daniel Harper." Emily carefully placed the letter back into its envelope. "He visited you?" Sarah smiled through tears. "Every year, for 19 years, he never missed. He'd mow my lawn if it needed mowing. He'd fix broken gutters. He'd bring flowers to Michael's grave. And every single time, he thanked us." Emily looked stunned. "He thanked you?" Sarah nodded. "He always said he was sorry he couldn't bring Michael home." Neither woman spoke for several moments. Outside, traffic moved through the afternoon as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Inside the newsroom, another piece of Daniel Harper's character quietly settled into place. Public attention continued growing. The regional VA office announced an internal review. State veterans organizations demanded answers. A senator's office requested copies of Emily's documentation. For the first time in years, Daniel's case was no longer just another claim number buried inside a filing cabinet. It had become a question of trust. Late Wednesday afternoon, Daniel drove to the community center carrying several boxes of donated winter coats. Children were laughing on the basketball court nearby. Inside the building, volunteers sorted canned food for local families. No cameras followed him. No reporters interrupted him. He preferred it that way. As he stacked boxes against the wall, a young Army veteran named Luis approached cautiously. Luis had returned from Afghanistan only 18 months earlier. PTSD kept him awake most nights. "You got a minute?" Daniel nodded. They walked outside beneath an old oak tree. Luis stared at the ground. "I don't sleep." Daniel remained silent. "I keep hearing things. Doors slam, fireworks, cars backfiring. My wife says I'm home. I don't feel home." Daniel understood every word. "I used to count ceiling tiles until sunrise," he said quietly. Luis looked surprised. "You?" Daniel smiled faintly. "For a long time." "What changed?" "I stopped trying to win the fight alone." Luis's shoulders relaxed. "I thought maybe something was wrong with me." Daniel gently shook his head. "Something happened to you. That isn't the same thing." The younger veteran wiped his eyes. No speech could have helped more than those simple words. Sometimes healing began with being understood. That evening, Emily received another call. This one came directly from Washington. The Department of the Army had agreed to release additional records recently cleared through declassification review. Not everything, but enough. The digital files arrived just before midnight. Operations maps,
radio logs,
medical evacuation timelines. Then one document stopped Emily cold. An after-action statement signed by multiple surviving soldiers. Daniel Harper repeatedly entered the engagement zone despite direct orders to withdraw. She continued reading. Remained with wounded personnel after sustaining significant injuries. Refused evacuation until all recoverable soldiers had been removed. Emily covered her mouth. She understood now why every witness described Daniel the same way. Not because he had performed one extraordinary act, because he had made the same impossible choice again and again. Thursday morning brought something no one in Ashford had expected. Cars began pulling into the parking lot outside the veterans' shelter long before opening time. Pickup trucks, SUVs, old sedans carrying military decals. One by one, men and women stepped out. Some wore unit caps, others carried folded flags. A few held small cardboard boxes. Daniel arrived, confused by the gathering.
What is all this?
Frank rolled forward in his wheelchair.
We're waiting.
For what?
For you.
Daniel looked around uneasily.
You don't have to do this.
An elderly soldier approached carrying a faded photograph.
You remember me?
Daniel studied the picture first, then the man's face. Slowly, recognition appeared.
David?
The older veteran smiled.
I told you I'd make it home.
Daniel embraced him without speaking. Soon another veteran stepped forward, then another. Families followed. One woman carried the bronze star that had belonged to her late husband. Another brought a photograph of twins who had never met the medic responsible for their father's survival. None of them had come seeking attention. They had come because gratitude had waited too many years. Emily watched quietly from a distance. No speeches had been planned. None were needed. Every handshake carried its own story. Every embrace completed one that had remained unfinished for decades. As the morning came to an end, a black government sedan pulled into the parking lot. A uniformed army officer stepped out carrying a sealed envelope. He approached Daniel respectfully.
Mr. Harper.
Daniel accepted the envelope.
The department requests your presence in Raleigh next Tuesday.
What for? The officer hesitated.
There will be a formal hearing.
Daniel looked from the envelope to the gathering around him. For the first time in 20 years, the officer said carefully,
Someone is finally prepared to listen.
The officer returned to his vehicle and drove away. Daniel stood silently beneath the fluttering American flag, holding the unopened envelope. Across the parking lot, Emily noticed another vehicle arriving. An elderly man stepped out slowly, leaning on a cane. He carried a weathered military field case chained shut with an old brass lock. When Emily recognized Colonel Whitaker walking toward Daniel, she also noticed something else. The colonel's hands were trembling. He looked at Daniel with an expression somewhere between sorrow and relief. Then he quietly said the words that changed everything. I found the evidence. For a long moment, no one spoke. The parking lot outside the veterans' shelter seemed to fall silent beneath the gentle flutter of the American flag. Even the traffic beyond the trees faded into the background as Colonel Thomas Whitaker carefully lowered the weathered field case onto the hood of Daniel Harper's truck. I've been looking for this for years, the colonel said quietly. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the brass clasp. Inside were neatly preserved military documents wrapped in waterproof sleeves that had yellowed with age. Beneath them rested an old satellite radio log, a handwritten casualty report, several sworn witness statements, and a sealed envelope bearing the official seal of the Department of the Army. Daniel stared at the case without reaching for it. I thought it was gone. So did I, Whitaker replied. It should have been. Emily stood nearby with her notebook forgotten at her side. She wasn't thinking like a reporter anymore. She was watching history return to the man it belonged to. Whitaker lifted the sealed envelope. This package was never supposed to leave military custody. What happened? The colonel took a slow breath. After the convoy attack, the mission remained classified. Parts of the operation involved intelligence assets that couldn't be disclosed at the time. During the review, several files, including yours, were removed from the standard personnel record. Daniel looked down. I remember. You also remember insisting that no one challenged the decision. Daniel nodded once. There were younger soldiers, families, careers. Whitaker's voice grew softer. You accepted responsibility for decisions that weren't yours because you believed it would protect them. Daniel offered only a tired smile. They had their whole lives ahead of them. And you? I had already made peace with mine. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. For years, people had assumed Daniel had been forgotten. The truth was even more painful. He had chosen silence because he believed someone else deserved a future more than he deserved recognition. The hearing took place the following Tuesday inside a federal conference room in Raleigh. There were no television lights inside, no cheering crowds, only long wooden tables, American flags standing in each corner, representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs, military officials, legal advisors, and several members of Congress observing quietly. Daniel entered wearing the same brown jacket he had worn the day his claim had been denied. He had not bought a new suit. He had not tried to impress anyone. He simply walked to his seat with the calm confidence of a man who had already survived worse places than any hearing room. Emily sat near the back. Colonel Whitaker occupied the witness table. The room settled into silence as the chairwoman of the review panel spoke. Mr. Harper, thank you for being here. Daniel nodded politely. Thank you for inviting me. The first hour focused on documents, medical evaluations, deployment logs, operational timelines. Every missing record was compared against the newly recovered field documents. One by one, the gaps disappeared. The timeline became complete. The explosion, the injuries, the evacuation, everything matched. Then came the witness testimony. Marcus Doyle entered first. Walking steadily on his prosthetic leg, he faced the panel without hesitation. I wouldn't be alive if Staff Sergeant Harper had obeyed orders. The room remained perfectly still. He pulled me out of a burning vehicle. He went back. And then he went back again. Another veteran followed, then another. Each told a different part of the same story. One described Daniel carrying 2 wounded soldiers across open ground, while incoming fire struck only yards away. Another recalled Daniel using his own medical supplies after unit equipment had been destroyed.
A third admitted something he had carried for nearly 20 years. I was the officer who made the mistake that day. His voice cracked. The report should have named me. But Daniel convinced everyone to leave my name out of it. He told me I had a wife and newborn daughter waiting at home. He said he'd already accepted whatever happened. The man lowered his head. I've lived every day knowing he carried a burden that belonged to me. No one in the room moved. Daniel looked toward him and gave the slightest shake of his head, as if to say, "It's over. You came home. That's enough." The final witness entered just before noon. An elderly civilian wearing a dark blue suit carried a slim archival box. He introduced himself as Robert Gaines, former records preservation officer for the Department of the Army. I retired 15 years ago. He placed the box on the table. During an archive transfer last winter, workers discovered a mislabeled storage container. Inside were dozens of forgotten military files.
One belonged to Daniel Harper. Gaines carefully removed a document protected beneath clear plastic. The original battlefield medical report. Another. The evacuation confirmation. Then another.
the official recommendation package. The chairwoman accepted the final folder. She opened it slowly. Inside rested the recommendation that Emily had seen only in partial form. This version was complete. The citation described Daniel's repeated actions under direct enemy fire, his refusal to abandon wounded personnel despite suffering serious injuries himself, and the extraordinary courage that saved numerous lives. The final line read, "Recommendation approved at command level. Final processing delayed pending classified review. No subsequent action recorded." Silence filled the room. Not the silence of uncertainty, the silence of people realizing that history had almost forgotten one of its own. Later that afternoon, the panel returned with its decision. The chairwoman stood. "Mr. Harper, after a complete review of all available evidence, this panel unanimously finds that your combat injuries were unquestionably sustained during active military service." She paused. "The denial of your disability claim is hereby overturned. Your earned benefits will be restored in full, effective immediately." Daniel closed his eyes for only a second. Not in celebration, in relief. The chairwoman continued. "The department also acknowledges that significant documentation failures contributed to this outcome. We offer our sincere apology." Daniel slowly stood. "You don't owe me an apology." Several people looked surprised. He continued gently. "You owe every veteran a promise. Don't let this happen again." No one applauded. The weight of those words required something deeper than applause. Several officials simply lowered their heads. 2 weeks later, the town of Ashford gathered beneath a clear autumn sky at the Veterans Memorial overlooking the old courthouse square. Rows of white folding chairs stretched across the lawn. Families arrived carrying small American flags. Children sat beside grandparents who had once worn uniforms of their own. The sound of a lone trumpet drifted through the crisp afternoon air as taps echoed across the memorial. Daniel stood quietly near the front. His jacket had finally been replaced by a simple dark suit, though he still wore the same Army veteran cap in his hands. Emily watched from the crowd. She no longer felt like an outsider telling someone else's story. She felt honored simply to witness its ending. The ceremony remained simple. No grand speeches, no political statements, only gratitude. A senior Army general stepped forward carrying a presentation case. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper. "On behalf of a grateful nation," he paused, "it is my privilege to present the decoration that should have been placed in your hands many years ago." Daniel accepted the medal with both hands. For several moments, he simply looked at it.
Not with pride, with remembrance. He wasn't thinking about awards. He was remembering faces, voices, friends who never grew old. After photographs had been taken, Daniel stepped to the microphone. The crowd became perfectly still. "I've been asked many times over the past few weeks whether today feels like justice." He looked across the audience. "I don't know if that's the right word. My friends who never came home won't be standing here beside me. They paid a price greater than I ever did." He glanced toward the rows of veterans seated together. "I accepted this medal for them. And I accepted these restored benefits because they were earned, not just by me, but by every man and woman who served honorably." His voice remained calm. "The greatest honor isn't something you wear. It's making sure no veteran has to fight alone after coming home." Many in the audience wiped away quiet tears. There was no shouting, only a long, heartfelt standing ovation. The following morning arrived quietly. Before sunrise, Daniel drove alone to the military cemetery. The grass still glistened with dew. Fog drifted gently between the rows of white marble headstones. He carried a single white carnation. He stopped before the grave of Specialist Michael Lawson. For several moments he said nothing,
Then he knelt and placed the flower carefully against the stone.
The paperwork finally caught up, Mike.
A faint smile crossed his face.
Took them long enough.
He stood. The first rays of sunlight spread across the hillside, illuminating hundreds of white markers in soft golden light. Daniel removed his cap. He saluted. Then he turned and began walking toward the waiting road. Not as the forgotten veteran who had quietly accepted injustice, not as the man whose records had nearly vanished, but as someone whose honor had finally been restored. Behind him, the morning breeze lifted the American flags lining the cemetery. Ahead of him lay an ordinary life that would continue much as before. He would still volunteer.
Still repair wheelchairs.
Still visit lonely veterans. Still stop for strangers beside broken-down trucks. Because medals had never defined who Daniel Harper was. Characteristic had. And that was something no missing file could ever erase. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and honor those who served. And that was something no missing file could ever erase. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and honor those who served. Daniel Harper walked away from the cemetery after placing a single white carnation on Specialist Michael Lawson's grave, carrying no bitterness, only the quiet peace of a man whose honor had finally been restored. In the end, it wasn't the long overdue medal that defined him, but the life he chose to live every day after the war. Daniel's journey reminds us that true honor is protected by the choices we make, not the recognition we receive.
Justice may arrive years later than it should, but when the truth finally stands in the light, it still has the power to heal. Today, take a moment to thank a veteran, listen to someone's untold story, or simply choose kindness before judgment. You may never know how many silent battles someone like Daniel Harper has already fought before crossing your path. Did Daniel Harper's story change the way you see the quiet heroes living among us? Tell us in the comments which moment touched your heart the most. And share this story with someone who believes courage deserves to be remembered. Until next time, we'll bring you another remarkable story that proves some of America's greatest heroes are the ones history almost forgot.